Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for tonight's event with Peter Ames Carlin in conversation with LA Times' Robert Lloyd, here to discuss Sonic Boom, the impossible rise of Warner Brothers records, from Hendrix to Fleetwood Mac to Madonna to Prince. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
And we'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them by signing up for our email newsletter on our website, following us on social media at Book Soup. You can also follow our Crowdcast page here and see past events on our YouTube channel. Our next event is this coming Thursday, January 21st at 6 p.m. with debut author Ellie Eaton with Rufy Thorpe and Bellatrix Cara Priest to discuss Ellie's novel, The Divines. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the viewer screen. If you see a question on the list you'd like for our speakers to answer, you can click the like button and it'll bump it up in the queue, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation in the chat area. Also, please consider supporting Book Soup and our author tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, which you can do by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen. It'll take you to the Book Soup website, and it will not interrupt viewing, so you can do that at any time tonight. And with that said, let me introduce our guests for this evening. Peter Ames Carlin is a writer and the best-selling author of several books, including Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon and Bruce, the biography of Bruce Springsteen. Carlin has also been a freelance journalist, a senior writer at People in New York City, and a television columnist and feature writer at The Oregonian in Portland. A regular speaker on music, writing, and popular culture, Carlin lives in Portland, Oregon. And our other guest this evening is Robert Lloyd, who has been a Los Angeles Times television critic since 2003. Previously, he held that position at LA Weekly, whose music editor and critic he also was for some years, and was the author of the Today column at the late Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. His oral history of Freaks and Geeks appeared in the January 2013 issue of Vanity Fair. Sometimes, usually after dark, he masquerades as a musician. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to our wonderful guest this evening. I'm so excited. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you both so much for being with Book Soup tonight.
Hello. Robert, do you have something you want to say up front? I think you're running the show. I'm going to defer to you. So you say introductory things.
Peter, I believe you have something to read for us.
Yes, I do. It comes from this book, Sonic Boom, of which we've just heard. Now, the interesting thing about Warner Brothers and the part of them that puts the impossible in the impossible rise part of the subtitle is the fact that they really took over as a dominant record company by marketing themselves to the hippie counterculture of the late 1960s. The turning point for the company really came in 1967 when Mo Ostin, who was then at that point just given authority over the labels, went to the A&R staff, the people who produce the records and find the artists, and gave them probably the most counterintuitive direction that any record company president has ever given his staff. And what he said was, we need to stop trying to make hit records. Let's just make good records and turn those into hits. And what he wanted was for them to find the strange, the most avant-garde and interesting and sophisticated artists that they could find, not worry about scoring top 40 hits, but just go ahead and find interesting artists who are going to make interesting records. Then they installed a new chief of advertising, a former liner note writer named Stan Cornan, and basically gave him license to create a new persona and a new set of advertisements for the company and their artists. And in 1969, that's what Stan started to do with a series of ads, subsequently known to this day as The Series. And so the little piece I'm going to read here begins with the launch of the beginning of the series. When Carnan's first ad showed up in January 1969, you might have thought it was a joke of some sort. Jethro Tull, a hairy fairy, and I spelled that F-A-E-R-I-E, folk rock band whose debut album, This Was, had jumped to the #5 slot on the British sales charts, had signed a deal with Warner Reprise and was just then heading for the American concert circuit. Ordinarily, the launch of an act would have been an occasion for a breathless sales job, a celebration of conquering heroes, and so on. Instead, Cornyn produced a full-page declaration of tough-loving skepticism. The headline, written strikingly in 24-point type across a plain white field that took up the top 2/3 of the full page it occupied, was this: an open letter to Jethro Tull. The bottom third of the page was taken up with a 500-word mini-essay describing the challenge lying ahead for the aspiring band. Sure, you're popular in England, it read, but right now the reaction of most of us Yanks is, who in the merry hell is Jethro Tull? He closed with a final wag of the finger. So, Jethro Tull, you may be hot spit in England, but here you've got a ways to go. That set up a litany of dates in the group's Warner Reprise supported American tour. Cornyn was only getting started. Randy Newman's first album, co-produced by Lenny Waronker and Van Dyke Parks, was released in the fall of 1968. The eponymously titled Randy Newman soared out of Burbank with the highest of hopes. Leading rock critics weighed in with strong praise. One of the most stunning albums released thus far in 1968, wrote Hullabaloo, which was echoed by testimonials from the Olympian tongue of Beatle Paul McCartney. How could it fail? Sure, Newman's songs, ranging from darkly comic takes on God to a stark portrait of an abandoned parent to a cheerfully repellent pitch for a freak show attraction, could be challenging, and maybe even more so given the artist's voice, a slurry New Orleans drawl that reminded some listeners of Ray Charles after a shot of Demerol. But the songs were terrific. The Warner Reprise staff couldn't stop playing it on their in-house audio system. And did that matter at all? No, it didn't. When the Warner Reprise sales department issued the numbers a couple of months later, Newman's Newman had sold a total of 4,700 copies. But the Warner Reprise people still loved Randy Newman. Ostin, in particular, really loved Randy Newman, so he kept the publicity money flowing. The art department recalled the existing albums and replaced the original, arguably cluttered cover with a new design featuring a close-up portrait of the artist. The sales force went after the distributors and record shop buyers with the fire of evangelists, and still no one would buy it. So Cornyn rolled a piece of virgin paper into his typewriter and, after a time, emerged with a splashy ad for the thus far benighted Newman. This time, the headline took on one of the artist's most vulnerable points, his burry, slurry singing. Once you get used to it, his voice is really something. The copy read, apparently it's taking longer than we thought to get used to that voice. Undaunted by the lack of rush to buy the album, we comforted ourselves with critical notices which, like they say, glowed. We also wondered, are we fooling ourselves? No, we decided, because people whose judgment we respected, like Mr. McCartney and Miss Collins and Mr. Nielsen, told us Randy Newman was in the masterpiece category. Where had we gone wrong? When that first ad failed to light a fire under Randy Newman, Cornyn came back with another full-pager. This time, the headline was even more striking. Want a free album? Okay. We'll give you a Randy Newman album. Free. Just write us. We'll send you one. You don't believe us, do you? Read on. Cornyn dished more of Newman's praises, but from there the ad was entirely about Warner Reprise and its employees' dented feelings, because they had all worked so hard on this album and believed deeply in what they were doing. And not only had their work all come to naught, but they were still being scolded by all the, quote, flower boppers who put them down for being soulless greedheads. What could they do to make you believe in their souls? Well, Cornyn had an answer. Our flower child put up or shut up free album offer. He wrote, for this one brief moment, darlings, for this one brief shining moment, darlings, you're seeing capitalism crumble before your eyes. As advertising pitches go, Cornyn's pieces were screwballs. They jumped, dropped, and quivered in their own velocity. The customary hard sell gave way to self-deprecation and confessions of failure and even self-doubt. And they were funny. not just about Warner Reprise's artists and the company itself, but about the entire music business and the celebrity commercial industrial complex that existed around it. To promote the Grateful Dead's first two records, Cornyn came up with the Pigpen Lookalike Contest, charging readers to send in hand-drawn renderings of the band's album covers, along with a photo of someone who resembled the group's hairiest, scariest-looking member. Do not please send in the actual people, Cornyn added. We got problems of our own.
Now, do you remember those ads yourself as a young person looking at music magazines, or is that something that you came and discovered later on?
I think, I became aware of Warner Reprise in exactly that year, 1969, because my dad came home with one of the two sampler albums that they had. But I don't think I know those ads until a little bit later, probably in the mid 70s or so. But I was definitely I was an early adopter as a 6-year-old, but I wasn't skimming Rolling Stone and underground newspapers at that time.
When did you start to conceive a sort of image of what this label was and what set it apart?
Well, I began to buy a lot of records when I was, probably still in grade school, a little toward the later part, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And a lot of those records turned out to be by Warner Reprise artists. And I would read everything. Those were the days when all the information you could get about an artist was on the album. And the albums, there was, they had the big front covers and the back covers, and often there were gatefolds that folded open with more photos and information. And then inside were the dust covers. And the difference between the Warner Reprise albums and most, virtually every other company was that there was a lot of readable material from the record company on the dust covers. And most of them were ads for those two record album sets that they called the Lost Leaders. And I remember reading those and thinking those were hysterically funny. And they were, completely sort of in that hippie counterculture voice. And he was talking about, why these sampler albums were so good. And one of the reasons was they only cost $2. And he said, if our accounting department were running the company, they'd cost $9.96, but they aren't, period, yet. And yet he also said, he talked about this benevolent record company, and yet cautioned people, that they weren't entirely benevolent, because the game was they were hoping people were going to get turned on to the artist and then buy their own records, at full market prices. And so that's it was that stuff on those inside folders that made me feel like these guys are different. They seem just like a bunch of funny hippies hanging around in Burbank, sort of doing their own thing. Like the counterculture had finally taken over a little chunk of capitalism.
Right. It's interesting that the passage that you chose to read was about an advertising man and advertisements in a book that's partly about making art.
Yeah, but he sort of turned it into a kind of art. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating is that Stan and the advertising department began to get fan mail, just like the artists got fan mail, because people loved the ads so much. I mean, and that's really, what made the difference, one of the things that really signified the difference and what was important about this company.
Now, some of these guys that like Cornyn and Mo Ostin and were from an older generation. And this period in the 60s is really this kind of moment in time where rock music sort of starts to go from this, what business people consider a fad and something that they can control for a couple of years, and to something that begins to look like an art form, or at least music that has legs of its own. What interests you about that moment in time? I mean, this is a book kind of about how that changes in some record companies and doesn't change in other record companies. This kind of collision of art and commerce.
The thing is, I've spent, I was a TV critic for a lot of years, and I've written about popular culture for almost my whole career, which goes back a distressingly long period of time now. And generally, you know, and especially in the books that I've been writing, I find myself constantly writing about that sort of battle between art and commerce in the, you know, in the sort of commercial arts. And what struck me about Warner Brothers Records was that it seemed like they got that balance exactly right, that they really respected the art. And you know, it was, you could sort of intuit that just by following the artists that they had on their label over the years. You know, one of the things I noticed was the fact that, you know, I'd bought hundreds and hundreds of records in the course of my, you know, my life as a music fan. And, you know, probably nearly half of them were Warner Reprise records, which is amazing because there's a lot of record companies out there. And it was all these different bands, and it always seemed like, you know, sort of in my top 5 of favorite bands of any given period in my life, like 2 to 3 or more of them were Warner Reprise bands. You know, starting early with like the Grateful Dead and those are, you know, the mid-period Beach Boys records in the '70s, and James Taylor and Joni Mitchell, and, you know, all the way up through, you know, R.E.M. and the Replacements, you know, and like Sire Records was one of their subsidiary labels. And so, and, you know, it was just like they had incredibly great taste. And in 2013, when I was working on a book about Paul Simon, I went in and actually got a chance to meet and interview Lenny Waronker, who had been the president of Warner Brothers Records and, you know, really one of their most influential people for years and years. And then, you know, there was that sort of corporate putsch in the mid-90s that sort of ran out Mo Ostin and the others. But he had come back later, sort of under the condition that he be allowed to basically go back to the job he started as a 23-year-old in 1965, making records. You know, that's all he wanted, was an office in the basement where he could, you know, listen to music and talk about music and make records all day long.
Do you think there's a quality that, I mean, obviously it's a wide spectrum of music, but do you think there's some quality that identifies an artist as, or that music gives it a sort of special something, a je ne sais quoi, that's different from what you might find on Columbia or Arista or RCA Records? Is there any kind of unifying theme artistically?
I think if you could really sort of draw a line from you know, like Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead all the way up through, you know, the artists in the mid 90s like R.E.M. and you know, it was the fact that they really were artists first, that they became, you know, musicians and popular musicians because they wanted to make art, and being famous was a secondary part of it. Whereas, you know, there's schools and schools of famous, successful musicians who wanted to be famous, and the way they did it was through music, or maybe they started out as musicians and then fell in love with the idea of being famous. But the Warner artists, like the ones that really come closest to the bone of the company, are the ones that really have a distinctive take on music and on making, you know, and really try to do something different with it, really try to express themselves with it, you know, and that's, you know, and that's what ties together, you know, say Joni Mitchell and Prince, you know, I mean, 2 very, very distinctive artists working in very, very different, you know, parts of popular music, you know, though of course ultimately they sort of, you know, they also overlapped in a lot of interesting ways. But and I think that's really what they looked for. I mean, Mo Ostin in particular just had an ear for artists that were going to be special in that way. And one of the things he really liked were artists who interested him not just musically, but were intellectually engaging as well. He really fell for the artists that had, you know, that had interests beyond music and could talk, you know, and were very articulate about that stuff.
There's kind of a quality, almost a fairy tale quality to this story. I mean, it's like this sort of Camelot of record companies. where things were sort of golden for a period of time. And when you were writing it, did you ever feel like you were being enchanted by the story to the point where you needed to remind yourself that you were a journalist and you needed to kind of keep an objective eye on it, or do you think that that's a real story? Do you think that that is actually that is the objective truth of it?
I think that, look, they had their failures like everybody has their failures. People are human, and they were not early adopters of feminist principles, as like not many people during the hippie era was, or were, distressingly enough. It was a pretty lily white operation. They had, even when they started a jazz division and a black music division in the mid '70s, the president, the heads of both of those divisions were white guys. They were hip to black music, and they made a lot of great records with a lot of great African American artists. But still, the guys in charge. So yeah, there were problems. But on the other hand, it's really hard to look at the records that they made over a period of a very, very long time. And also the amount of affection people have for Mo Ostin and Joe Smith, who was sort of his equal in the early days and kind of his number two through the mid '70s before he moved on. And then Lenny Waronker, who became Mo's second in command. I mean, these were people who were admired not just by the people they worked with, but also the people with whom they competed. I spoke to one fellow who was a president of Columbia Records for a time, and he told me, he said, look, every day I went to work at Columbia, we were better because we had to compete with Mo and Warner Brothers Records, because they were tough competitors. Mo was in particular. He was also a real hard ass of a negotiator. I mean, a fearsome negotiator. David Geffen, who is no pushover, would do anything he could to not have to negotiate directly with Mo. But the admiration they had for Mo, because ultimately he was fair. Ultimately he was a mensch, really. I mean, and people across the board. I mean, Clive Davis, of all people, who most often celebrates Clive Davis and has a lot to celebrate. He spoke at great length about his admiration for Mo. And it was real, it wasn't entirely scripted. And the artists feel the same way. I mean, obviously, nobody ever is, nobody doesn't have people who get aggravated by them. I mean, there are conflicts all the time. And I was aware of that. But there was a kind of, fairy tale's a bit strong, but, one of the things that really motivated me to do the book, I was just realizing that I started the book. I sort of got the first germ of the idea to do this book in January, about 4 years ago, which was right when Donald Trump became president. And the idea of sinking into this world that I had a sense, that I'd already known, learned enough about to realize had such an idealistic sort of vibe to it, that just felt like a heavenly place to go during the workday. And it's sort of cool to think that it was very cool to think about spending my time getting absorbed in the lives of people and the careers of people who really felt strongly about the art and really did put the art ahead of the money. I mean, you couldn't. It wasn't possible to forget entirely about the money. You couldn't lose money hand over fist, and every so often they had to make really tough decisions, and people felt like they got screwed a little bit. But on the other hand, again, the vast majority of people really came away feeling like they had been treated fairly and got the opportunity to do great work.
Had you ever spent so much time researching and thinking about the business side of arts? Most of your books are about artists. Was this a new experience going into the other side of that equation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was refreshing in a sense, because I have spent the last, most of the last 15 years or whatever, you know, in the books that I've written, you know, being about artists, and I love writing about artists, and obviously there was, you know, a lot of music and a lot of musicians, you know, in this book as well. But one of the things that made the Warner people different was that, you know, Mo encouraged the executives to kind of to behave like artists in a way, to take risks and to break the rules and figure out new ways to do things. And you know, you could, you know, people were encouraged to just you know, to do away with the tried and true and come up with a new way to do their jobs. And sometimes people would put together a big program or some sort of big new, you know, innovation in their department and launch it with great ballyhoo, and it would fall on its face. And in a lot of companies, that's just another way of them telling you goodbye, you know. Whereas at Warner's, oftentimes, you know, if you owned up to the fact that there was this, you know, that it hadn't worked out, people would be congratulated for having taken the risk, even if it was a failure. And so it was that attitude, and it was a real, you know, it's just interesting to think that people can be involved in corporate life and do it with not only an open heart, an open mind, but with something of an open heart and a real acceptance of, and you know, and you know, an interest in and enthusiasm for risk taking.
One of the things that this book works as is a kind of a stealth biography of Mo Ostin, of whom one would have thought there would be no such book possible to write because he's very private. Can you talk about just generally the importance of Mo, but also I know that you in the book you talk about he's this impossible get that suddenly you get. So if you could just talk about the experience of how you came to be able to speak to him and what you brought away from that in-person experience.
It was interesting, you know. I started the project with, you know, and I get this a lot when I start projects from about people that so and so is never going to talk to you, and that's just the way it is. And oftentimes, you know, sometimes that's true, and you never do get certain people, and you wish that you had. And then sometimes my experience has been, if I, you know, just try to do my work and focus on what I'm doing, and I'm serious about it, and develop a kind of, you know, develop the expertise and approach people with the right attitude and the right curiosity, that gets back to certain people. You know, I was very lucky early on to connect with some pretty important Warner's executives, and what I became aware of was the fact that they had the sense that they knew that they had done important work and had done good work. And they, I think, are at this point now where they feel like they didn't want it to slip away completely unnoticed, that there had been so much more writing done about, you know, Clive Davis and Columbia, and, you know, and Walter Yetnikoff, and all these other sort of super important, you know, record company executives and record companies. But for some reason, the Warner story hadn't really been told in a way that felt like lasting to them, that felt like something that was gonna do justice to their legacy. And I sort of came along at the right time, I suppose, and managed to connect with people, and they were still in touch with Mo. And you know, and a few months after I got started, you know, I got in touch with his son Michael Ostin, with whom he works very closely to this day. And Michael set up a lunch for us to have, and Mo was wary at first. He made it very clear he didn't want to talk, but on the other hand, at least not on the record, but once we started going, you know, I mean, he's he was voluble. I mean, he had a lot of stuff to say, and he was clearly proud of his achievements. And I think, you know, and then about 6 months later, I got an email from his office saying that he'd agree that he would talk to me after I was finished talking to everybody else.
Uh-huh.
And that was great news, you know. I mean, that was fabulous news. And so about 6 or 8 months after that, we finally sat down, and for whatever reason, he was ready to go. And Michael set up a video team to come and videotape the whole thing, and we probably talked for about 20 hours over a period of, 3 sessions over 4 or 5 days. And Mo, I think he's 93 years old now. He was 92 then at the time, but the guy is as sharp as a razor. The amazing thing is he can not only remember the details of contracts he had signed 60 years earlier, but down to specific clauses and how those clauses evolved during subsequent renegotiations. And it was a level of recall that, like, I don't have of what I had for lunch today. And he's an amazing man, really. And it was really, it's such a cliche to say it, but it was an honor to be able to talk to him.
You brought in, the one thing that sets him apart in the book is that you speak about his family to some extent. You speak about where he came, where he comes from, and he's really the through line for your book. Why did it feel important to include that kind of extra level of biography there that you didn't accord to Joe Smith, really? Or a little bit, but his wife is in the book and his kids are.
It was important, I thought, because Mo in so many ways was, he set the tone for the place in a way where you would almost think of him as, this is going to sound kind of weird, but as sort of the spiritual leader of the place. It was really his spirit and his warmth and his way of doing business that set the tone for, not only, in terms of the artists they signed and how they treated the artists, but also how they treated one another. It was a remarkably collegial place. People, there weren't political problems within management because the management was so solid for so long. There was, and he just, it was sort of his spirit that really sort of swept across the whole thing. And even now when people talk about him, they speak of him in these kinds of, with a level of affection and respect and admiration that you don't hear so unanimously from about any other chief, any other chief executive. And so it was interesting to try to figure out, like, where that came from. Like, what was it about him that made him just personally so influential over people? But he really could connect with people, and he could really, and it seemed also to them very much that he cared about them. He wasn't the most, he's not like a huggy, glad-handing type of individual. But when you talk to him and you connect with him intellectually, he really listens. He's really there, and he's really engaged, and he really does care about the people that he encounters and works with.
Did you find, were there things that, over the process of researching and writing it, things that you thought that you no longer thought at the end, things that where you had changed your mind about your image of something, about not necessarily Warner Brothers in particular, but just about how music is made and how it's marketed, and any surprises like that?
I think the real surprise for me was just exactly how strange they could behave at that company in the 60s and the early 70s, and just how wild things could get there, and, they had a real, Mo really kind of ran the place like a sort of for-profit art commune for the longest time. And it was really fascinating to hear it said again and again, it was true that sometimes they would sign artists that they knew were never going to be popular just because, as Lenny liked to say, they deserve to make records for a mainstream company. And what they would do was they would take, the profits that were being made by Fleetwood Mac and by, the huge artists that they had to subsidize their work with these other artists. And Mo and Lenny both felt a real obligation to just to music itself. They had this idea that if they, gave contracts to and made records, with people who were stretching the form, they may be too avant-garde for the mainstream to ever catch up with, but they were going to be kind of fertilizing the fields, as it were, and seeding the rest of the culture so that music was going to stay healthy and, and have new places to go and new things to do.
Most of the book takes place, I would say, 3/4 of the book kind of gets you to the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at what's happened in the 40 years since 1980, do you see that there are opportunities in the world of music and music making that resemble what happened at Warner Brothers at all, or do you feel like we're in some completely other world?
That's an interesting question. I mean, Warner Records still exists, and even though it's owned by very different people and managed by different people, there still is, I think, in the DNA of the company, I think they really do respect their legacy, of the previous generations of the people there, and then Lenny Waronker is still there, and they like having him there. In the A&R department, in some ways, just being a kind of Yoda character. I mean, he still does work, and he works very closely with Guy Clark Jr. and does, he's still making records. But there's a lot of sort of institutional, the heritage stuff they're very serious about. In terms of what else is going on in the industry, it's a little hard for me to keep on top of it because it's so wildly diverse and it's taking place in so many different forms and formats. I mean, the one thing about the collapse of the mainstream record industry as a result of digital music and streaming and all that is the rampant democratization of it. That your band, a bunch of high school kids in somebody's bedroom working with Pro Tools on their laptop can make a professional caliber record and distribute it globally just by putting it up on Bandcamp or something.
Right.
And every so often that stuff really connects. And then suddenly, you don't have to compromise with anybody really. Certainly not a company, a mainstream company. So, but I'm 57 years old and I'm way past it in terms of knowing what's going to happen next, or exactly what's going on in the industry.
We have a few questions in the hopper here. I'm going to see what's what. The first is, when interviewing Mo Ostin and Lenny Waronker for the book, did you get a sense they knew what the impact of their work at Warner Brothers Records was on the music culture all those years later? Also, did they have thoughts on today's music?
Yeah, I think they're both quite aware of the impact they had. I mean, one of the things about them is that they're pretty humble guys in their way. I mean, which is why it took so long to get Mo to crack open and talk about himself, which is why he was so loath to talk about himself for so long. And Lenny is in some ways the same way, I mean, that both of them were, at the time when they were at the top of the game, at the top of the company, they were not the type of chief executives who had their own publicists. They didn't want to talk about themselves. They pointedly said again and again, it's the artists who are important, not us. And yet they also understand, the achievements of the artists that they worked with and the people that they worked with and helped make their work possible, on their end, on the corporate end, the front office end. In terms of them knowing what's going on in music today, probably Lenny's got a little more of a finger on the pulse of it just because he works there every day, and he's surrounded by, his fellow workers are, a third his age, really. and he loves that. I think he loves being in the swirl of it and is hip to it. I think, Mo may be less so, but he's been retired for some time now. And, and like a lot of us, or most of us, or all of us, he loves the music that he loves and the stuff that he grew up with. And I'm sure he listens to new stuff too, but I don't get the sense that he's sitting around thinking about Billie Eilish too much.
Right. One of the scenes in the book has to do with the closing down of the chalet, um, the historical home of Warner Brothers Records out in Burbank. And Burbank, which itself was part of the whole mythology that they used to sell the records around. And moving to the Groovy Arts District in Los Angeles. Did you have an experience of the new headquarters?
No, you know, my entire experience of the company was at the chalet in Burbank. Yeah, I'd love to check out the old Ford factory down there in the Arts District, but I just, you know, by the time really my most active reporting period ended with the you know, the same month that the chalet shut down, and I had a chance to go to the farewell party when they invited all the alumni in to
Right.
take one last look through the building. And it was a pretty emotional day, and it was really interesting to be with those folks then. And see that happening because so much history took place in that building. I mean, you know, they had this big open patio, and artists would come and play lunchtime sets. And so, you know, you come out of your office one day, and there's Prince and his whole band playing a set there. You know, and you know, it was you know, an amazing place.
We're going to go to the hopper again for another question here. Did Mo or any other interviewees have an opinion as to whether their WB was strictly a phenomenon of the times, or could it possibly be replicated now in the digital age? Did anyone opine if today's digital environment would have made breaking artists easier or more difficult?
We didn't get into that much. I mean, I think that one of the things they had going for them, which people don't now, is a corporation that was you know that was not only allowing them to do their own thing, but you know, as a result of Steve Ross and his hands-off attitude about the record companies, but also the fact that they were making so much fucking money year in and out, just double-digit, you know, profit jumps year in and year out, that they just had a lot of money to throw around, and you know, and to invest in and take risks with, and you know, obviously not many record companies have that these days, or so it seems. But again, I mean, I think the difference now is that it is possible for artists to do it for themselves. You know, I don't know that it's easy for them to do it. I mean, one of the big problems with the industry these days is that you have, you know, a tiny fraction of artists who are making scads of money, and then you have a whole lot of artists who aren't doing very well at all. But there used to be that big middle class of artists who would sell, whose records might go gold or might, you know, somewhere around there, and they were able to tour and they could make a decent living. And a lot of that has gone away because record sales have collapsed to such a degree, and you know, streaming doesn't really benefit the artists to the extent that it should.
Here's another from the hopper, and it says, did Mo have any reflections on what it was like when the label had to let go of career artists like Van Morrison and Bonnie Raitt in the 1980s?
It was horrible for them. I mean, and that was in 1983, I think, was the year that was the year they had to cut Bonnie Raitt, and Bonnie was family to them. I mean, they loved Bonnie Raitt, but that was where you had to, you know, they had to wield the corporate blade, you know, because you get to a point where, you know, the company's in trouble. I think that was the point at which the video game company that they had, who's yeah, had suddenly the bottom had fallen out of their industry, you know, their industry or their end of the industry, and suddenly the company was just hemorrhaging money, and there was a hostile takeover bid, and it was a huge crisis. And so when word came down from New York that they had to cut a significant amount of their annual budget, it was just they had to do what they had to do. But for the vast majority, you know, and of course they felt terrible about it. But that's, you know, but it's, again, you know, it was art and it was music, but it was also a business, you know, I mean, and the art and the commerce, they held it. I think they did an excellent job of keeping that in balance for an incredibly long period of time. But, you know, that didn't mean that they could absolutely ignore the commerce part. that event, there were moments when they were going to, when that called the dance, as it were. And they had to make really, really tough decisions. They felt terrible about it, and I think they still do. But, those moments, but I think those were far outnumbered by the moments when they could invest in cool artists and give them time to find themselves and find an audience.
Another one starts, "Hey, Peter, what tended to be the balance between the creative freedom of WB's artists and the executives of A&R teams' involvement with the artistic direction of the artists?" I'm thinking of things like Prince's over-prolific output, Paul Simon's expansion into world-hopping ZZ Top's image overhaul, Van Halen's ditching of their singer at the height of their popularity, etc. What was the role in the company in these kinds of moves?
Oftentimes they would just let the artists do what the artists felt they had to do, what they wanted to do. I mean, when Lenny I was talking to Lenny about working with Simon and Garfunkel in the early '80s when they were making that reunion record, that much ballyhooed reunion record. And Paul's first album for the company, which was also that movie One Trick Pony, it's a beautiful record, but it just didn't sell very well, and it and the movie lost a ton of money. And they signed him for a lot of money. He was a very expensive signing for them. And so then Simon and Garfunkel did the concert in Central Park and the reunion tour, and the live record came out on Warner's, and that made them a bunch of money back. So that was good. And then they were going to have a new original Simon and Garfunkel record to sell, which obviously was going to be a huge hit out of the box. People were keening for that record, but they just weren't getting along. And one day Paul called Lenny and Mo and said, "Look, this isn't going to work. I'm going to take Artie off all these songs, and I'm going to release this as a solo record," which turned out to be Hearts and Bones. And obviously they were crushed. They were going to lose a lot of money on that. But what are you going to tell an artist? I mean, how are you going to force these guys to work together? And if you do find a way to force them to work together, they're not going to make an album that they're probably not going to make an album that's going to be good. And they let Paul do what he wanted to do. And and a couple of years later, when he went off to do this music in South Africa, it was a crazy, Paul Simon, the boxer, Sound of Silence. What the hell is he doing? Making a township jive record in South Africa? It didn't make any sense. And when the tapes began to come in, a lot of people on the staff didn't get it. And there was a lot of concern, but two people who really did get it were Mo and Lenny. And Mo made it extremely clear to the staff that they were not only were they going to push this record, they were going to push it hard because he knew it was good and it should be a hit, and it was. And I'm sure the same thing with Van Halen. I'm not as acquainted with the details of their career as I am with some of the other artists, but in some ways that was a 2-for-1 deal. David Lee Roth leaves the band, and then he's having solo hits on his own, at least for a little while, and they're having hits with Sammy Hagar. It was a risk, but it was one that ultimately paid off. Ultimately, I think that they just really just accepted that the artist had to do what felt right to them to make the art that they wanted to make.
Did you have any, coming at the subject from this angle through the business, give you any new insights into musicians and how they work? Did it change your feeling about the process of making the art?
I don't know that it changed it per se. It brought, I developed certainly new clarity about certain artists, the Warner Brothers artists and how they worked. And one of the things that was sort of cool and inspiring about Warner's was, there wasn't that moment, for a band where the A&R person was going to sweep in and tell them what to do. Lenny, I heard a story from Peter Buck and from R.E.M. about when they were making Out of Time, I think, their that record that sort of broke them through to the mega sales level. But it was very much something of an out of character record for them. And so they played. They sent the acetates or whatever, the advanced tapes to Lenny, and he listened to it, and he came to the sessions with a checklist of 10 suggestions that he had, and one of them was like, take the rap part off of Radio Song, and I really don't think that Losing My Religion is the lead single, and et cetera, et cetera. And Peter Buck very proudly told me, we ignored all of them, and then he went through the list and we explained why we weren't going to do each of the things that he suggested. And Lenny was a little crestfallen, but then he said, well, you have such good reasons. What am I supposed to say? Do what feels right, and it was a great call for him because the record came out and it was a huge smash. Later, I talked to Lenny about it, and he goes, well, it didn't really happen that way, and da-da-da-da-da. But by and large, I mean, it was interesting to see that, I never heard from anyone that some A&R person came in and ordered them to change anything on one of their records. I think they probably had ideas. They may have had strong ideas, but really, I think, if it wasn't in the contracts, it was definitely in the DNA of the company that at the end of the day, it's the artist's decision.
What was, as a kind of for you personally, what was the emotional, might not be quite the right word, but what was the personal experience for you of taking this project on and seeing it through to the end?
It was really, again, I was saying earlier that it was, in some ways, it was my reaction to, or my escape hatch from the Trump era, where, which was governed just by money, 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 and avarice. And here were a bunch of people who seemed to be living by this kind of counterculture ethic, even through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And and changing with the times, and eventually the company got more slick, and the music got more slick, and it wasn't all furry freak brothers the entire time.
It wasn't Van Dyke Parks Records.
I'm sorry?
It wasn't Van Dyke Parks Records.
But it was still Van Dyke Parks Records, because he was on the label, all the way till 1998,
Right.
and they signed him again and again, and they just loved the records that he made, or Mo did. And so, but Van Dyke wasn't very prolific, so it didn't, it was every 6 or 8 years he'd come up with something and it'd come out and it'd be really cool, and it wouldn't sell many copies, unfortunately. But I'm sorry, what was your original question? I got a little. What was the emotional experience?
Your emotional journey.
It was nice to be around so many cool people. I met a lot of people through this, and by and large, I really enjoyed spending time with them. And they were all serious music obsessives, very deeply involved with the art, and very, ambitious people. Sometimes they would disagree about who did what and who should get credit, but they wouldn't really squabble too much about it. That they were it was nice to be around people who were just nice people, who had spent their lives working really hard to achieve stuff, and had had a lot of successes, and came away from it. Some of them were made extraordinarily wealthy, and others weren't. But really it seemed like they'd all felt like the years they spent at Warner's were the best years of their lives.
Okay, well, I think there's one other question might have come into the box here, and we'll ask that, and then we're about at the end of our hour, so hang on here. Do you have any insight on Tom Petty's last DJ album? A funny place to end up, but that's the question.
Well, I don't really have any insight into that record, to be honest. I'm sorry to have to say, but there is, but the great story, the Tom Petty signing with the company is a cool story, because he was, it happened sort of through his getting involved with the Traveling Wilburys, with George Harrison's band, and Dylan and those people in the late 80s. And he was upset with, I think he was with MCA at the time, and he wasn't thrilled with how they were handling his stuff. And he basically negotiated a deal with Mo and Lenny, signs and sealed it, and they kept it in a vault because he still had 5 years and 5 records left on his previous contract. And they had agreed on a number. This was the interesting part that wasn't well known. And but when it was finally time for him to start his new deal at Warner, it turned out that, you know, the prices for artists of his caliber had gone up a lot more than they had anticipated. And now he felt like he wasn't gonna, you know, the deal wasn't quite big enough for an artist of his caliber. So he sent his manager to talk to Mo, and the guy very sheepishly went in and said, "Tom wants more money." And they, you know, but they had already signed. They had a signed deal. Mo could have just sent him out of the office, like, "No way, forget about it." But Mo's a smart guy. Why have an unhappy Tom Petty? So he said, "Okay, what do you want?" And the guy went away and figured out what artists of, you know, Tom's caliber were getting those days, and he came back in with a number, and Mo looked at it and he said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." And so he, you know, he bumped up the money accordingly. And you know, and then Wildflowers came out, and they probably made it all back on that one record.
Well, thanks, Peter. I think Sam might be lurking around here somewhere. I don't know how we close this event down. We're about an hour mark. There she is.
I'm right here. Thank you both so much for such a great interview. Thank you everyone in the chat for contributing and asking such amazing questions. Please consider buying Peter's book right at the green button and support independent bookstores, even if it's not from us. And thank you so much again for taking time out of your Tuesday evening. I actually had to look at what day it was. Still Monday in my head. But everyone have a wonderful night. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Robert, for taking the time and being with us tonight.
And thanks to you and to Robert very much, and also everyone who showed up. I really appreciate your being here. Thanks so much.
Yes. Everyone have a wonderful night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.